Good morning. My name is Larry Donley, and I'm the great-grandson of John Donley, and he's the person who built this log cabin. I'd like to spend a few minutes this morning speaking to you about the history of the log cabin. So it has a long and varied history, and now is at the Richmond Historical Society in Richmond, Michigan. We'd like to start out this morning and talk about when John Donley came to America. This was in 1848. He sailed on the bark Christiana vessel from Cork, Ireland to New York City. This is a manifest of the ship, and on this line right here is where John Donley, D-U-N-L-E-A, signed his name. He was 22 years old. Later, his two brothers, Michael and Patrick, joined him in America, and after arriving on New York, they negotiated for some land in Michigan, I guess sight unseen. So this is our family tree, and this is where John is located, and I've noted here he's the individual that built the cabin. John was born in 1820. He was born in Ballyporeen, Ireland, in County Tipperary. He died in America in 1885. He was married to Ellen Hickey, and then later, after she passed away, to Mary Berry. The three brothers purchased land in America in Lenox Township. They bought 160 acres of land located on the Lindsay Road, today referred to as the 29-mile road. This is a copy of the deed that was registered in Macomb County when they purchased this land. If you'll notice here, later in some other documents it showed that it was determined that there was back taxes owed on this property, and so we believe that the price right here of $465 for 160 acres of land. That seems like quite a bit of money in those days, but nevertheless, it was 160 acres of prime land in Lenox Township. These three brothers began to clear this land, which was primarily forested at that time, to prepare it for farming. They had been farmers in Ballyporeen, and they continued that occupation when they came to America. The land was cleared, and many of the logs that were cleared were used to build this cabin. It was somewhat crude, but it was the method of housing new immigrants as they arrived in this country at that time. It was a substantial building. As you can see, huge hand-hewn logs throughout. It was they didn't have concrete at that time, so the building, the foundation was primarily made of large rocks gathered from the countryside and used under the corners of the cabin to form a foundation.
His father's name was John too, and they lived in the village of Ballyporeen in County Tipperary. And the famine came to Ireland in 1841, and over the next 5 years it got worse and worse. 1848 is still referred to as Black 48 in Ireland. And there were 4 boys in their family. The 2 older ones were married and had children of their own, and they collected the small amount of money they had, and they sent John, the third son, age 22, to America. And he came to New York, and he found, or maybe they found him, a land agent there who was selling land in Michigan. But he didn't have any money, so he made an arrangement to, we can't tell exactly from the records, but he must have made some arrangement to lease the land and pay for it later. And then he got his second brother to come. They built a log cabin and moved in there. And then eventually the third brother came and the fourth brother came. But he died when he was quite young. He was about, I think he was about 60 when he died. He was 22 when he came to America. And there was that was before Ellis Island. Being an immigrant to America was pretty easy in those days. A ship came up the East River and he walked off and walked around on the streets of New York. And then somehow got to Michigan. We weren't able to figure out how he got there. We did find the records in the Mount Clemens courthouse of when he and two of his brothers became citizens 7 years later. And there's a copy of the papers in the courthouse are still there. And the schools and the churches had been closed in Ireland for 200 years because the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so they were uneducated and illiterate. And their citizenship papers are signed with a shaky X. He wasn't very old, but his hand was shaky. And his name written in under the X by some clerk, I guess, in the court.
John Donley had a son by the name of Thomas, who lived in the cabin as well. Thomas was located right here. Thomas Donley was born in 1855 in Lenox Township, and he married Catherine Sullivan, who was also born in Lenox Township, just south of where the cabin was located. And they then built a new, larger, more modern home across the road from the cabin as they begin to acquire more land to enhance their farming capabilities.
Your grandfather Thomas died, I believe, before you were born, right?
Yeah, he died when my dad was only 6 years old. The land there is, we saw some refuse trucks on the way there today coming from Canada, because that farmland has been converted into a landfill now. It has a lot of clay content, and those landfill people were looking for heavy clay to deposit their refuse in. And what he did, Tom, my grandfather, because of the heavy clay content there, that land dries late in the spring. And it was, the growing season was diminished by that, and regular American horses would sink in that clay before it dried out in the spring. He had what seemed like a brilliant idea to import some Belgian horses. And the Belgian horses had very big hoofs. And the theory was that they could walk on the clay when it was still wet and get started planting earlier. Well, unfortunately, one of these Belgian horses was not well trained, I guess, and kicked him in the stomach. And that was before there was any antibiotics or anything like that, so he had an infection and died a week later. And my dad was 6 years old, and his sister was 2 years younger than he was.
Wow.
Catherine and Thomas Donley had 2 children. Their children's name was Hugh, my father, and his sister, Mary. This is Hugh. He was born in 1890, and his sister was born, Mary was born in 1892. Hugh married Frances Mary Gavin. Frances was my mother, is my mother, and was born and raised in Columbus Township, north and of Richmond. Hugh and Frances were living in Detroit after their marriage, and my father was working in the automotive industry. My mother was a school teacher and began to have their family. In the 1930s, my father came back to the cabin and began to restore it, as it had fallen into a pretty in a non-livable condition. This was an article written up by the Monitor Leader, which was the Mount Clemens newspaper, in 1931, describing how my father was rebuilding the cabin in memory of his grandfather. It's quite a story. This picture was taken in front of the log cabin after they restored it and used it as a weekend getaway from their home in Detroit. This is a picture of my brothers taken on a summer day outside the log cabin. This was my brother Ed, my brother Frank, Hugh, Joe, and myself, Larry, the little guy here. This picture is the same, not the same day, but a similar time frame. And as you can see here, it's some of the same children: Ed, Hugh, Joe, Larry. My father and mother were all dressed up. They must have been going or coming from church on a Sunday, and somebody took their picture right in front of the cabin. This is not the same day, but probably the same summer or nearly that time frame. In 1933 or 34, not quite sure which, my father moved our family from Detroit to the home across the road from the log cabin, and that's where we lived from 1930 in the 30s to the 50s. In that time, at that time frame, my brothers attended the Cledgett School, which was located on Gratiot Avenue, north of the cabin, 1 mile. It was a one-room country school, and they began to attend classes there until they were of high school age, and at that time they were transferred from there to St. Augustine's High School in Lenox.
Before, we came and lived here in the beginning about, I've forgotten the years, in the early 30s, when the Depression came and everything was lost in Detroit. And there was a well here, just outside there, which had been dug by my great-grandfather, John Donley. And that was salt water. And there was a well, see, I think this is where it was then. It was 3 miles from here, but the well was right outside of the log cabin. And then an eighth of a mile away on the other side of the road was the farmhouse, which had been built by my grandfather, Tom Donley, when he was married to Catherine Sullivan, who lived on a farm about 1.5 miles away. And we used to bring the water in a bucket and keep it. There's a little kitchen fenced off here, and there was storage space underneath those steps that went up to the second floor. But the fire would be allowed to go out on a winter night in a little cast iron stove that was here, and whatever water was left in in the bucket. That was frozen in the morning.
And recently, Dad was telling me his father was a school teacher. Both of his parents were school teachers, and they sat around this table at night, and your father would quiz you, right?
Yeah, we had to be able to recite the multiplication tables. We had to be required to name the capitals of the various states and so forth. And whoever missed the questions was the one who had to wash the dishes after dinner. And that was a nasty job because we didn't have hot water and we didn't even have fresh water. All we had was salt water. But I was the oldest, and he expected me to know more than I did, so he used to, I thought that he the toughest questions for me. 7 times 9 was always a sticker.
Yeah, what's the answer then?
Get your calculator, right?
Was it like going to the is it Cledgett School, about a mile from where the log cabin was? What was it like going to school in a one-room schoolhouse?
Well, there were about 30-odd kids in that school. One teacher, Mrs. Shibley, and the older kids would be expected to teach the younger kids, and then each class would be expected to come up and recite and answer her questions during a particular time of the day. And so we did that. And I was the teacher's pet. She really liked me.
So you got to do special things? To get special privileges of being teacher's pet?
Well, she gave me the great honor of being selected to come in an hour early and start the fire. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but my dad felt, well, if Ed's got to get up and go there an hour early, some of the other boys would take care of feeding the pigs in the morning.
That had its advantages.
So I got relieved of that onerous job.
In 1940, living in our home across from the cabin, in the summer there was a fire took place and destroyed our home across the road. Completely destroyed it. There wasn't a thing left except a small amount of furniture that was removed from the first floor. At the time that the day that fire took place, my parents were working on the farm east of there, and I was babysitting there with my brother Michael. There were actually 2 men, single men, living in the cabin working in one of the automotive factories in Detroit. One of them ran to the house, rescued Michael, took him out, and so although we lost the house, we saved everybody. And of course we had to have a place to live, so my father asked these 2 men if they would vacate the cabin, at which time we moved in. Now at that time, in 1940, it was the only place we had to live while the house was being rebuilt, and this took the better part of 2 years. During that time frame, there was my parents and 6 of us children living in this cabin. Needless to say, it was a pretty crowded place. And let me describe how the living area was. There's a loft upstairs which extended from the one end to the other, and there was a flight of stairs going from that point up to the loft. The children's beds were up there, and I can tell you they were essentially wall-to-wall beds. In the downstairs, in this corner, there was a small room partitioned off that was used as a kitchen. The fireplace that you see here was not installed at that time. It was installed much later. But when we were living here, there was a kitchen in this corner over here. There was this was a living area in this corner here to the right. I vividly recall in front of this window at Christmas time when we had our Christmas tree there in front of that window. The rest of the area was made up of a living room and one double bed in this corner for my parents. My parents slept down here, if you can imagine that, with 6 scampering children up above. Some experiences. In the center of this room, right about here, there was I can think it was almost right here, there was a large pot-bellied wood-fired stove. That provided the heat for this entire cabin. There was a small chimney over on this side. The stovepipe went up through there over to the chimney, and this is what was used to heat the cabin. When you move into a cabin with a family, no plumbing, no running water, there was interesting times. Right outside this window was a well that was down dug in the ground about 25 feet and lined with stone. That was the well that served provided the water for this cabin. In the summertime, the well is very cool, and my mother devised a plan of lowering a bucket with bottles of milk and butter to preserve them from the heat, where there was no refrigeration in this cabin at that time. So it was an interesting time to what you ate, where you ate, and how you preserved and prepared your food. Of course, we lived on a farm, and we had a large garden, and there was lots of vegetables and things to eat and prepare, and so it was not a sophisticated kitchen we had, but an ample amount of great fresh vegetables and milk and butter that was refrigerated, and some pieces of meat in the bottom of the well where it was a cool temperature.
In this corner, we had a round oak table, which we have at our home in Pennsylvania now. That was my grandparents' table, which they bought when they got married in 1886, I think it was. And so that was our main place where we ate our meals. And there wasn't any fireplace then. There was some steps that went up to the loft up above, and we all slept up there. The place was heated by a little, I guess you'd call it a cast iron stove, and which we burned wood in, and that went up a little chimney and out from the roof up above. See, I went away to go to college in 1939 or 40, and the family still lived in a log cabin, but then when the people had leased the farm, and when their lease expired, the family moved across the road to the farmhouse. And then, unfortunately, the farmhouse burned, and then I was already in college, but the farmhouse burned, and the family moved back and lived in a log cabin until it was rebuilt. I'll say one comment about my mother and father.
Okay.
They went through enormous hardship, and my dad thought in the 1920s, when Detroit was the Silicon Valley of the 1920s, real estate boom was taking place, a bubble just like the one that burst not so long ago. And he invested in a number of houses by putting mortgages on them, and we had a nice middle-class home in Detroit with bedrooms on the second floor and indoor toilets and a washing machine in the basement, and so my parents were living a lot. Not they weren't rich people, but well off, and then when the Depression came and the real estate bubble burst, everything was destroyed financially, and we moved from that really luxurious life in Detroit back to the log cabin, which was a regression of probably at least a century, so that our life changed from what it was in the 1920s to what it had been in Ireland in the 1840s. But they just accepted it, and the bond between them was very strong. And I realized, not so much at the time, but later, when I thought about it, that the fire burned, which burned down the house after all the other vicissitudes that they had. The house burned down, and it burned because my mother had left a fire in the kitchen stove, a wood fire, and hadn't closed the damper, and it was quite clear that the fire popped out of the stove and started to burn there and was out of control, and the whole house was gone. So after all the difficulties that they'd had, then this was a further difficulty piled on top of it. And I think I've had a reputation for having a hot temper. If that had happened in my case, I think I would have said to my mother, in the name of God, why did you not close that damper? My dad never said one word of criticism of any kind to my mother, and she to him.
When your father Hugh died, your mother became a teacher. Was it in the Claggett school that she taught first?
No, she had been a teacher earlier. She grew up on a farm in St. Clair County near Columbus, and in those days you could she dropped out of school after 10th grade and went 1 year to a normal school in St. Clair, I think it was, and at that time that qualified you to become a certified teacher. And so she taught in the school, in different schools for a few years until they were married in 1920. And then she stopped teaching and spent her time having babies. And then after Dad died, she went back to teaching, but she was not, the laws had changed, and she didn't have the credentials to be certified in a regular public school. But that was during the Cold War, and there was fear at that time in the country that Soviet bombers were going to come over the North Pole and bomb us, and so they had fighter Air Force bases established across the northern part of the United States, including Selfridge Field, not far from here. And they had a lot of young soldiers there and their wives, a lot of kids, and they couldn't, there wasn't capacity in the public schools to teach all those kids, so they set up schools on the air base. And there was a shortage of teachers. And although Mother didn't have the full credentials, she got approved to teach in one of the schools on the Selfridge Air Force Base. And she kept getting that extended year after year. She went to weekends and summers and evenings to Wayne State University in Detroit and took courses and eventually became qualified to teach in the public schools.
If she was raising, well, 7 children, but you were gone away to college at that point,
Yeah.
and she was also teaching, there must have been someone to help out. Was it just the boys and girls at home, or was there someone else?
Larry and
It escaped.
you,
My
Joe.
brother Hugh ran the farm, and he reenacted slavery and got Mike and I to work for, well, there was supposed to be a great pot of gold, but we never saw that. But he ran the farm, and Mother ran the family and taught school. And you knew, that everybody had to pull their weight. But we made it to fine. She was, I often think now, the term, we didn't ever hear it then, a single parent, but she was certainly a single parent, And she taught, and Hugh ran the farm, and we went to school, and every couple of years somebody graduated from high school and peeled off and escaped, and finally Hugh got married and Mother moved to New Baltimore, and she continued teaching in the New Baltimore school system, and we all went our way, and we ended up going to work and live where we went to work, and we got ourselves scattered all over the country. Mike stayed here in Michigan and lives in Lake Orion today, and my sister Marianne and Bill Kessler, her husband, they took a job in Idaho Falls for a while and moved out there, but eventually come back to Michigan. And Marianne followed her mother's footsteps and became a school teacher and a principal, and so it was kind of a DNA thing there that was in the family. But there was a lot of people coming out of the Depression in the early 40s that had to really, America was coming out of a very, what the Depression was, and America was in tough shape, and we were not unique. There was a lot of people in the same straits, and it's a great credit to this country how they pulled themselves through, and quite frankly, until the economic times we're in right today, this country boomed. Ever since World War II, and if you wanted a job, you could get it anywhere, any place. So this is just another, I think, indication of how this country was built. Immigrants from Western Europe poured into this country. Now they're coming from the Spanish part of the world, and everybody may have some criticism of America, but if they get a chance to come here, they're sure on their way.
Let me say one other comment
Okay, sure.
about Mother
Okay.
at Selfridge Field. They really came to love her there, and we have a picture somewhere of her. She was elected as an honorary U.S. Air Force officer, honorary, and had an Air Force uniform, and I don't know where the picture is, but it's stored away somewhere.
So living in the cabin was a great experience. As I say, there was my parents, 6 children, and we always, of course, had some friends that wanted to come and sleep in the cabin, stay overnight. Why my mother permitted this, we'll never know, but it was a great experience for a lot of our friends who we went to school with to come down and visit and have the experience of staying in the cabin.